Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, Llorumi. If you guys have been around in the Ninjago fanbase ever since 2018, then you've most likely heard of this. And if you haven't, I'll give you the short version of what this is. Llorumi is the name given to the relationship between Lloyd and Harumi. It first started during Season 8, and calling this relationship controversial is one of the biggest understatements that you can make when it comes to Ninjago. While there are definitely a lot of people in the fanbase who do like Llorumi and think it's good, there's also a lot of people in the fanbase, myself included, who really don't like the relationship and think it's bad. And in today's video, I decided that I wanted to analyze Lloyd and Harumi's relationship over the events of the show and dissect it in order to see just how toxic this relationship really is. So, let's get into this whole thing. Now, before I actually talk about Lloyd and Harumi's relationship during the show, I feel like it's important if we take a look at Lloyd and Harumi prior to them meeting each other during the events of Season 8, so we can see what positions they were in when it came to their lives prior to them meeting each other. When it came to Lloyd, he's gone through a lot of trauma over the years when it comes to Ninjago. For starters, Lloyd never really had parents growing up as a result of Garmadon being banished in the underworld and Misako essentially abandoning Lloyd at Darkly's boarding school for bad boys. Lloyd also had to give up his childhood during Season 2 as a result of the Tomorrow's Tea. Also during Season 2, Lloyd had to fight against Garmadon on multiple occasions. By the time Season 4 ended, Garmadon was sacrificed and he was sent to the Cursed Realm. Moro possessed Lloyd during the events of Season 5, and so much more. And when it came to the ending of Season 7, the most recent season prior to Season 8 coming out, Lloyd went through some more trauma, with Sensei Wu getting lost as a result of time travel, and Lloyd having to take on the very big responsibility of him becoming the new leader of the ninja team. Not only that, but at the beginning of Season 8, Lloyd was faced with the possibility of Garmadon returning. So when it comes to Lloyd, it's safe to say that he wasn't in a very good position when it came to his life at the beginning of Season 8. When it comes to Harumi, on the other hand, she lost both of her biological parents during the Great Devourer attack, and as a result of said attack and Harumi losing her parents, she grew to obsess over Garmadon to the point where she started an entire biker gang / cult dedicated to worshipping him, and Harumi wanted to resurrect Garmadon so he could take over Ninjago and become its emperor. However, at the same time, Harumi also grew to hate the ninja and she wanted to get revenge on them. More specifically though, Harumi wanted to make sure that Lloyd would suffer more than any of the other ninja, because Lloyd is the ninja who Harumi hated most out of all of them. So that's where Lloyd and Harumi were prior to them meeting each other during the events of Season 8. So now let's actually take a look at their relationship over the events of the show. So, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them first met each other during the Season 8 premiere, and for the first half of Season 8, we saw the two of them together a lot. We saw the two of them talking to each other, interacting with each other, and getting a chance to know one another. And when it came to the season, it looked like these two would end up getting together at some point during the events of the show. That was, however, until the end of the episode The Quiet One, where at the end of the episode, it was revealed that Harumi was actually a villain the entire time, and during the next episode, Game of Masks, it was revealed that Harumi was actually manipulating Lloyd and using him the entire time, also that way she could get the Mask of Hatred. And so, with the knowledge that Harumi was actually manipulating Lloyd the entire time, let's take a look at Lloyd and Harumi's interactions over the course of the first half of Season 8, and let's see if we can determine what's really going on between these two. And when you take a look at Lloyd and Harumi's interactions during the first half of Season 8, with the knowledge that Harumi is manipulating Lloyd, you see one thing happen over and over again, and that is Harumi taking advantage of Lloyd's vulnerability. Like I said earlier, when it came to Lloyd following the events of Season 7, Lloyd wasn't in a very good position when it came to his life, and Harumi was completely aware of this, so she decided to capitalize on it. Harumi manipulated Lloyd so that way Lloyd would end up developing feelings for her. Also, that way, when Harumi ultimately betrayed Lloyd, the betrayal would hurt even harder than it would have initially. Harumi wanted Lloyd's heart to be broken, also that way he could feel more pain. In fact, during the episode Dread on Arrival, Harumi even told Lloyd, "There's nothing more powerful than a blow to the heart," showing that when it came to Harumi, she wanted him to gain feelings for her, also that way his heart would ultimately end up breaking and he would be hurt even more than he would have initially by Harumi betraying him. Moving on though, we also see some very interesting developments get made when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi's relationship during the episode Game of Masks. For starters, this episode essentially acts as a turning point when it comes to Harumi, because from this episode onward, Harumi essentially does whatever she can to hurt Lloyd. Whether that's emotionally, mentally, psychologically, or physically, again, from this episode onward, Harumi started to do whatever she could to hurt Lloyd. In fact, during this episode, Harumi even took out a knife and she tried to stab and essentially kill Lloyd multiple times during the episode, and towards the end of the episode, Harumi even attempted to drown Lloyd. And there's something that I want to point out when it comes to Harumi doing all this stuff to hurt Lloyd during the events of the show. There's never once a moment during the show where we see Harumi showing any real signs of sympathy and remorse for Lloyd being hurt. Instead, the show shows us the opposite, and we see that whenever Lloyd is in pain, Harumi enjoys it a lot, making it clear that when it comes to Harumi, she likes seeing Lloyd getting hurt and she enjoys seeing him suffering. However, that's not the only interesting development that's made when it comes to this episode. When it comes to this episode, it ends up revealing two very interesting things about Harumi's thought process. For starters, this episode reveals that whenever something really bad happens to Harumi, she will place all of the blame on Lloyd and she will act like he is the one responsible for that bad thing happening to her, even if Lloyd had nothing to do with that bad thing happening, yet Harumi will end up manipulating Lloyd into believing that he was responsible for that bad thing happening. We see that happen during this and the next episode, where Harumi talks about her parents dying as a result of the Great Devour, and Harumi places all of the blame on Lloyd. She never blames the Great Devour, even though it was the thing that killed her parents, and she never blames Pythor and the other Serpentine, even though they were the ones who unleashed the Great Devour. No, Harumi places the blame on Lloyd, and she acts like he was the one responsible for this happening. And as we see during the next episode, Harumi was able to manipulate Lloyd into believing that he was responsible for her parents dying, even though he wasn't. During the Season 1 finale, when the Great Devourer was attacking Ninjago City, when it came to Lloyd at the time, he didn't have any powers, he didn't know how to use Spinjitzu, he barely participated in the fight, and he spent most of the fight inside of Nia's mech. Lloyd had absolutely nothing to do with Harumi's parents dying, yet Harumi still places all of the blame on him, and she acts like he's the one responsible for this happening. And yes, you could make the argument saying that when it comes to Harumi, she blames Lloyd because he's the one who unleashed the Serpentine, which eventually led to the Great Devourer getting unleashed. However, I feel like that's not what's going on here, and it's for a few reasons. For one, it's unknown whether or not Harumi actually knew that Lloyd was responsible for the Serpentine getting unleashed. Secondly, Harumi never mentions the Serpentine getting unleashed at any point during the events of the show. In fact, the only Serpentine who she ever really talks about is the Great Devourer, and that's it. And third, even though, yes, Lloyd was responsible for unleashing the Serpentine, he was not responsible for unleashing the Great Devourer. Pythor was. Because when it came to Pythor, he was the one who united all the Serpentine tribes, found the lost city of Ouroboros, made the map to the Fangblades, found the Fangblades, and then brought the Fangblades to the lost city of Ouroboros in order to unleash the Great Devourer, also that way the Great Devourer could consume all the humans. Meanwhile, when it came to Lloyd, he was 10 years old and he just wanted candy. He never intended for things to go this far, and I doubt that Lloyd actually would have wanted any of this stuff to happen. So again, when it comes to Lloyd, he's not responsible for anything revolving around Harumi's parents dying, Yet Harumi still blames him for her parents dying, and as we see during Drawn on Arrival, Harumi was able to manipulate Lloyd into believing that he was responsible for this, even though he wasn't. However, this isn't the only time where we see this happen, because we see the exact same thing happen during Crystallized. Specifically, during episodes 13 and 14, we see that Harumi is angry at Lloyd, and the reason why Harumi is angry at Lloyd is because she blames him for her dying, and as we see during episode 14, Harumi was once again able to manipulate Lloyd into believing this, with Lloyd telling Harumi, "I know you hate me, and maybe I deserve it," showing that again, Harumi was able to manipulate Lloyd into believing this, even though yet again, Lloyd was not responsible for this bad thing happening. When Harumi died during the events of Season 9, Lloyd didn't have any powers. He was on a completely separate building on the other side of Ninjago City, and after all the horrible stuff that Harumi did to him over the events of the Oni Trilogy, Lloyd had every reason not to help Harumi, yet once again Harumi was able to manipulate Lloyd into believing that he was responsible for this bad thing happening, even though he wasn't. And I feel like when it comes to Harumi doing this kind of thing, it is a perfect example of how toxic this relationship is. Because again, when it comes to Harumi, whenever something bad happens to her, she ends up placing all of the blame on Lloyd, and she ends up acting like he's the one responsible for that bad thing happening, and she ends up manipulating Lloyd into believing that he was responsible for said bad thing happening, even though once again, Lloyd had nothing to do with any of the bad stuff that happened to Harumi over the events of the show. But that's not it, because this episode also reveals something else very interesting about Harumi's thought process. And when it comes to this episode, it's revealed that when it comes to Harumi, she believes that when it comes to her and Lloyd, she is the one who suffered more out of the two of them. We see a bit of that during this episode with Harumi once again talking about her parents dying, and she says how she died on that day too, but we see more of this during Crystallized, more specifically during episode 16, where during this episode, Harumi yet again talks about her parents dying, and she says how she's all alone in the world. And keep in mind, when it comes to Harumi saying this, she is saying it to Lloyd, and she's saying this after she tried to kill the original 4 ninja using explosive spider bombs, and when Harumi tried to do it, she told Lloyd that she could deactivate the explosives, but she wouldn't, making it clear that Harumi was willingly trying to do that, and she wasn't being forced to. And this also happened after the Council of the Crystal King invaded the monastery, stole the golden weapons, blew it up, tried to kill everyone inside of the monastery, and Harumi is the one who told Lloyd about the monastery being blown up and everyone inside of it being dead, and Harumi did all of this specifically to hurt Lloyd and make him suffer. Yet Harumi is talking about how she's the one who suffered more than he did. And I feel like yet again this shows just how toxic this relationship is, because I feel like this shows that when it comes to Harumi, she clearly doesn't care about Lloyd and the stuff that he's gone through, and instead when it comes to Harumi, she only cares about herself and the stuff that she's gone through. After this, during the next episode, Dread on Arrival, Harumi forces Lloyd and Misako to be present for the resurrection of Lord Garmadon, and while Garmadon is being resurrected, Harumi has Lloyd and Misako take turns being dunked inside of piranha-infested waters. However, before the resurrection starts, Harumi tells Lloyd, and I quote, "There was never anything between us," making it crystal clear that when it came to Harumi, she never cared about Lloyd at all, and she was just using him the entire time. And as a result of hearing this, we see Lloyd getting his heart broken, and we see how upset he is after hearing this. And after that happens, we get the "there's nothing more powerful than a blow to the heart" line from Harumi. Then, in the next episode, True Potential, after Garmadon gets resurrected, Harumi forces him and Lloyd to fight against each other inside of Cryptarium Prison, and while they're fighting, Harumi broadcasts the fight to everyone in Ninjago so they can watch the fight, and while the fight is happening, we see Harumi laughing the entire time, with the show once again making it clear that Harumi is enjoying this and she likes seeing Lloyd suffer and him getting hurt. And when it comes to the fight, Harumi only tells Garmadon to stop fighting against Lloyd After Lloyd was already beaten senseless by Garmadon, after Garmadon told Lloyd, "I have no son," after Garmadon threw Lloyd through multiple walls of Cryptarium prison, and after Lloyd was on the last inch of his life, that is when Harumi finally told Garmadon to stop. Also, that way Lloyd could remain alive, so Harumi could then make him suffer even more. And I feel like this yet again shows just how toxic this relationship is, given the lengths that Harumi is willing to go to in order to make Lloyd suffer and have him feel pain. And plus, like I said earlier, when it comes to Harumi, she clearly enjoys seeing Lloyd suffer and him getting hurt. And once again, I feel like this shows just how toxic this relationship is, given all the stuff that Harumi is doing to make Lloyd suffer. And then we have the season 8 finale, where we get what is arguably the worst thing Harumi ever did to Lloyd over the events of the show, where during the season 8 finale, Harumi forces Lloyd to watch the Oni Titan crush the Destiny's bounty and seemingly kill the original 4 ninja and Sensei Wu, who, reminder, during the events of season 8 was turned into a baby at the time. And as a result of this happening, we see Lloyd break down into tears and he starts crying. And this is the big reason why I consider this moment to be the worst thing that Harumi ever did to Lloyd over the events of the show. When it comes to Lloyd, he has been through so much and he has gone through so much pain, suffering, and trauma over the events of the show. Yet this was the first time where Lloyd ever cried during the events of the show. And I feel like this shows just how much Harumi hurt him, because Lloyd was finally brought to tears as a result of something bad that happened to him. Also, speaking of Harumi, as a result of all the stuff that happened, when it comes to Harumi and her seeing Lloyd crying and him being hurt, Harumi straight up tells Lloyd, and I quote, "This is what I wanted, to see your father return and for you to lose everything. How does it feel to see the end?" And I feel like that right there perfectly encapsulates how little Harumi actually cares about Lloyd and how much she hates him. When it comes to Harumi, in that moment, she forced Lloyd to watch what he and everyone else thought was the death of the 4 original ninja and Sensei Wu. 5 of the people who took in Lloyd and raised him up and taught him what it meant to be a good person. And when it comes to Harumi, again, she forced Lloyd to watch the 5 of them die, and when it comes to Harumi, she is laughing at Lloyd for his suffering and she's mocking him for it, and Harumi straight up told Lloyd that she wanted this to happen to him. Again, when it comes to Harumi, it is so clear as a result of her doing this that she does not care about Lloyd in the slightest, and she hates him and she only wants him to suffer. And then after this happens, Harumi then tried to kill Lloyd again. So that's basically it when it comes to stuff during Season 8, so now let's move on to Season 9, and admittedly there isn't as much stuff to talk about during Season 9 because Lloyd and Harumi don't really interact with each other that much during the events of Season 9. However, there are a few things that we do see between the two of them during the season. For starters, at one point when Lloyd is giving his "The Resistance Never Quits" speech, Harumi ends up playing footage of his and Garmadon's battle against each other, which causes Lloyd to lose his confidence, and after Harumi gets captured by the Resistance, she tells Lloyd how Garmadon loves her more than him. Although, speaking of Garmadon, he's actually related into another thing that happens when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, and it's something that happens during the episode 2 Lies, 1 Truth. During this episode, Harumi presents Garmadon with the idea of him adopting her, and Garmadon ultimately accepts this, making Harumi his daughter, and by extension, Lloyd's sister. And when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi being siblings, this is something that has been confirmed as canon. When it comes to Tommy Andreasen, the co-creator of the show, he said on an interview that he was on the TTV YouTube channel that Lloyd and Harumi are adopted brother and sister, meaning that from this episode onward, Lloyd and Harumi are related to each other. And I feel like this makes the whole thing between Lloyd and Harumi even worse than it already was, because in addition to Lloyd and Harumi's relationship being super toxic and abusive, now when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, again, they're related to each other. And that's pretty much it when it comes to stuff that happens during the Oni Trilogy. However, before we move on to Crystallized, I want to talk about Lloyd, and I want to talk about the stuff that happened to him as a result of the relationship with Harumi. When it comes to Lloyd, there's a lot of stuff that happened to him as a result of Harumi's betrayal and all the horrible stuff that she did to him. For starters, Lloyd ended up gaining trust issues. This is something that we saw a few times during the events of the Oni Trilogy, but it's something that we mainly saw during Season 11, where Lloyd wasn't sure who he could trust outside of members of the team, and Lloyd's entire character arc during Season 11 revolved around him overcoming his trust issues and him learning to see the good in the world again. However, that's not all, because I feel like there's something else that happened to Lloyd as a result of Harumi's betrayal, and that was Lloyd no longer loving Harumi. I honestly feel like as a result of Harumi's betrayal, Lloyd stopped loving Harumi, and instead, Lloyd became obsessed with Harumi. More specifically, though, Lloyd was obsessed with the fake version of Harumi that pretended to like him. Lloyd had essentially convinced himself that the fake version of Harumi was the real version of Harumi. Meanwhile, the version of Harumi who was doing all these bad and terrible things wasn't the real version of Harumi. And this is something that we saw during the episode Drawn Arrival, where during the resurrection of Lord Garmadon, Lloyd told Harumi, and I quote, "This isn't you," and Harumi even tried to use this to manipulate Lloyd at the end of the episode. And again, I feel like when it comes to Lloyd, like I said, he essentially stopped loving Harumi and he was instead obsessed with the fake version of Harumi. And when it came to Lloyd believing that the fake version of Harumi was the real version of her, this is something that Lloyd would have to accept wasn't true. And this is something that we actually saw during Season 11, more specifically during the episode Secret of the Wolf. Also, speaking of Season 11, that actually relates into another thing that I want to bring up when it comes to Lloyd, and that is his Wild Brain character arc. Something that we saw play out during the Wild Brain era of the show was Lloyd going through this massive storyline revolving around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her. And honestly, this is a storyline for Lloyd that I really liked. It was nice seeing Lloyd getting a chance to move on from this toxic and abusive relationship that he was in with this girl who hated him and wanted him to suffer. And as a result of this, Lloyd was able to put the past behind him and move on with his life in a healthy way. Not only that, but Lloyd was able to overcome his trust issues, he learned how to see the good in the world again, and he ended up pushing multiple characters to be the best versions of themselves. Again, this is a storyline for Lloyd that I really liked. Also, when it comes to Lloyd, there's one other thing that I want to point out, and this is something that was said by Tommy Andreasen. When it comes to Tommy Andreasen, back in 2019, some fans were asking him some questions about Lloyd and Harumi, and when it came to Tommy Andreasen, he said that when it came to Harumi, she didn't really care for Lloyd, and Tommy Andreasen also pointed out that Harumi tried to kill Lloyd multiple times. Plus, when it came to Tommy Andreasen, he also said that when it came to Lloyd, he didn't think that Lloyd would want to spend eternity with Harumi. And I think that this is pretty interesting because when it comes to Tommy Andreasen, he's saying that potentially Lloyd didn't even want to end up with Harumi, which is something that I find to be pretty interesting. And given the fact that when it comes to this thing that Tommy Andreasen is saying, and he is the co-creator of the show, I feel like this is a really big thing that we need to take into consideration. Like that again, when it came to Harumi, she didn't care about Lloyd, and when it came to Lloyd, it's possible that he didn't even want to get together with Harumi. But then Crystallized happened, and it ruined everything. When it came to Lloyd and Harumi during the events of Crystallized, like I said earlier, we saw some stuff like Harumi blaming Lloyd for her dying, even though, like I said, Lloyd had nothing to do with Harumi's death, and we saw Harumi doing a bunch of really terrible stuff to Lloyd during the events of the season, mainly with Harumi trying to kill everyone close to Lloyd. However, one thing that we saw from Lloyd and Harumi over and over again during the events of Crystallized was Lloyd continuously fixating on the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. all throughout the events of Crystallized, when it came to Harumi, she kept on doing bad and terrible things all throughout the season, yet Lloyd kept on fixating on the idea of her changing. And this makes absolutely no sense. Now, yes, there is that obsession with the idea that Harumi wasn't actually a bad guy like I talked about earlier. However, at the same time, like I said, when it came to Lloyd, he accepted the idea that Harumi was in fact a villain, and this is something that we saw during Secret of the Wolf. And like I said, Lloyd's entire Wild Rain character arc revolved around him getting over Harumi and moving on from her, so Lloyd fixating on the idea of Harumi changing during the events of Crystallized doesn't make any sense at all. Yet, no matter what Harumi does during the events of Crystallized, Lloyd continuously fixates on the idea of her changing and her becoming a better person no matter what, and as a result of this, Harumi once again takes advantage of this, and when it comes to Harumi, she continuously manipulates Lloyd over and over again during Crystallized, and Lloyd keeps on falling for it. Now, yes, when it comes to Lloyd during Crystallized, you could make an argument that when it comes to Lloyd, he's trying to apply Wu's lesson that the best way to defeat an enemy is to make them your friend, and that's what Lloyd is essentially trying to do with Harumi during the events of Crystallized. However, I feel like that's not what's going on here, and it's for a couple of reasons. For starters, during episode 14, when Lloyd brought up the idea of Harumi changing, Harumi actually laughed at the idea of her changing, suggesting that when it came to Harumi, she potentially didn't want to be saved, and she potentially didn't want to become a good guy, and she was fine as a villain. However, the other reason why I feel like Lloyd isn't trying to apply Wu's lesson here is because, like I said, when it comes to Harumi, she continuously does bad things to Lloyd over and over and over again during the events of Crystallized, and Lloyd keeps on fixating on the idea of her changing. And it gets to the point where I feel like Lloyd isn't really trying to apply Wu's lesson, but instead, when it comes to Lloyd, he basically has this unhealthy obsession with the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. In fact, during episode 16 of Crystallized, where at the beginning of the episode, Harumi told Lloyd about the monastery being blown up and everyone inside of it being dead, and remember, in episode 14, Harumi tried to kill the original 4 ninja, and from Lloyd's perspective, Harumi basically killed everyone close to him, because in both situations, her spider bombs were being used, so again, from Lloyd's perspective, it's like Harumi killed everyone close to him, and at the beginning of the episode, Lloyd is understandably very mad at Harumi, but then by the end of the episode, Lloyd goes right back to the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person, even though again, from Lloyd's perspective, Harumi killed everyone close to him. So again, this feels less like Lloyd trying to apply Wu's lesson, and instead it feels more like an unhealthy obsession that Lloyd has with the idea of Harumi changing. But that's not it, because there's one other thing that I want to go over when it comes to Lloyd's fixation on the idea of Harumi changing, and it's that when it comes to Lloyd doing this, this can actually be a symptom of real-world abusive relationships. Something that can be seen when it comes to victims in abusive relationships is them trying to stick it out in the relationship and them trying to get their partner to change because they care about their partner, even if their partner continuously does bad things and hurts them. And when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, when you boil everything down, it is a relationship between Harumi, an abuser, and Lloyd, her victim. And like I said, something that can be seen when it comes to real-world abusive relationships is victims trying to stick it out in the relationship and them trying to get their partner to change, even if their partner continuously does bad things. And this is exactly what Lloyd is doing during the events of Crystallized. Harumi continuously does bad things and she continuously hurts him over and over again, yet Lloyd continuously fixates on the idea of her changing and her becoming a better person, which is not a healthy mindset for him to have. Now, before we talk about the finale, there's something else that I want to point out. During the events of Crystallized, like I said, when it comes to Lloyd, he continuously fixates on the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person. However, at the exact same time, when it comes to Lloyd, he is actively against the idea of Garmadon changing. Even though Garmadon is actively trying to change and he wants to become a better person and he's trying to become a better person in his own way, Lloyd is completely against the idea, saying that because Garmadon's an Oni, it means that he isn't capable of caring or changing. And this doesn't make any sense at all. Why is it that Lloyd is perfectly fine with Harumi changing despite her doing nothing but hurting him and her causing Lloyd a ton of pain and suffering? Meanwhile, when it comes to Garmadon, who's actively trying to change and who was a good person during seasons 3, 4, and 5, Lloyd is completely against the idea. This doesn't make any sense at all. Now, sure, you could make the argument saying that when it comes to Lloyd, the reason why he's against the idea of Garmadon changing is because of all the terrible stuff that he did during the events of the Oni Trilogy. However, I feel like that's not what's going on here, and it's for a couple of reasons. For starters, Garmadon's actions during the events of the Oni Trilogy are never brought up at any point during the season. Secondly, when it comes to Lloyd, he's angry at Garmadon because Garmadon's an Oni, and when it comes to Lloyd, he doesn't want to tap into his Oni side and potentially end up like Garmadon. And finally, if Lloyd was angry at Garmadon because of the stuff that he did during the trilogy, then how come he wouldn't be mad at Harumi for the exact same reason? Because Harumi also did a lot of really bad stuff during the events of the Oni Trilogy, and she's also the entire reason why Garmadon is a villain again, because when Harumi resurrected Garmadon, she only brought back the evil side of him, and basically forced Garmadon to be a villain, yet Lloyd is essentially acting like Garmadon chose to be a bad guy again, which we know for a fact isn't true because of Season 8. So when it comes to Lloyd fixating on the idea of Harumi changing, despite being actively against the idea of Garmadon changing, this doesn't make any sense, and I feel like this also adds to the toxicity of Lloyd and Harumi's relationship by showing how Harumi's manipulation was able to affect Lloyd, because again, when it comes to Lloyd, he keeps on fixating on the idea of Harumi changing despite her doing terrible stuff to him all throughout the events of the show. Meanwhile, when it comes to Garmadon, who again is actively trying to change, Lloyd is completely against the idea. But before I move on from Garmadon, there's one other thing that I want to point out first. During the episode Christopher, and after Lloyd and Wu learn about Garmadon and him trying to change and become a better person, Lloyd asks Sensei Wu, "Are you seriously falling for this again?" And here's my question: what does Lloyd mean by again? This would imply that at some point in the past, Garmadon pretended to be a good guy only for him to ultimately betray the ninja and fight against them, which he never did. Whenever Garmadon fought alongside the ninja, either A, he was a good guy like during seasons 3 and 4, or B, Garmadon was a bad guy and he had his own plans and he was only fighting alongside the ninja so that way he could further his own goals, and the team was completely aware of this. And that was the case when it came to Season 1 and Season 10, so Lloyd implying that Garmadon at some point in the past pretended to be a good guy only for him to ultimately betray the ninja makes no sense, because again, Garmadon never did this. Harumi, however, did this, and I feel like this right here is another example of how Harumi's manipulation was able to affect Lloyd, seeing that when it comes to Lloyd, he's taking something that Harumi did in the past and he's applying it to Garmadon, acting like he's done this kind of thing, even though, like I said, Garmadon never did that kind of thing at any point in the past, and I feel like this just adds to the toxicity of Lloyd and Harumi's relationship. Finally, though, this brings us to the finale of Crystallized, where after Harumi swapped sides and she fought alongside the rest of the ninja, the Overlord ended up getting defeated, and her, Lloyd, and Garmadon reunited with the rest of the ninja, and upon seeing Harumi, the original 4 ninja all gave Harumi an angry look, which makes perfect sense because in addition to all the horrible stuff that Harumi did to Lloyd over the events of the show, Harumi in general was just an awful person. When it comes to Harumi, she resurrected two of Ninjago's greatest villains. She took over Ninjago City by force on multiple occasions during the events of the show. She created a team of evil villains specifically to take over Ninjago. She willingly worked alongside the Overlord for 2 years, which eventually led to the Crystal Apocalypse happening during Crystallized. She tried to kill the original ninja on multiple occasions during the events of the show. She blew up the Palace of Secrets, resulting in the death of the Emperor and Empress of Ninjago, who were her adoptive parents. During the season 8 finale, she let the Oni Titan rampage through the Ninjago City, which potentially resulted in a bunch of innocent people dying, and so much more. Yet, despite all of that, not only does the show completely ignore all the horrible stuff that Harumi did over the events of the show, and Harumi never takes any accountability for any of the horrible stuff that she did, and she never once shows any sign of sympathy and remorse for any of it, and she never apologizes to Lloyd and the other ninja for doing any of that stuff. When it comes to Lloyd, he tells the other members of the team, and I quote, "It's okay, she's with us." And in my opinion, this makes absolutely no sense at all. When it comes to Lloyd, he is way too quick to forgive Harumi considering all the truly terrible and awful stuff that she's done over the events of the show, and the only reason why Lloyd is so quick to forgive Harumi is because she fought alongside the ninja, even though Harumi only fought against the ninja for a completely selfish reason. When it came to Harumi, she didn't swap sides and fight alongside the ninja because she realized what she had been doing was wrong, or out of the goodness of her heart, or because she was being forced to do bad things and this was the first chance that she had to turn against the Overlord. No, the only reason why Harumi decided to fight alongside the ninja is because the Overlord revealed that he corrupted the Great Devourer, and that was it. When it came to Harumi, she fought alongside the ninja for completely selfish reasons, and like I said, Harumi never took any accountability for any of the horrible stuff that she did during the events of the show, yet Lloyd was really quick to end up on good terms with Harumi. Meanwhile, when it came to Garmadon, who, remember, was actively trying to change and who wanted to become a better person during the events of Crystallized, we never really saw the two of them end up on good terms prior to the finale, and the closest that we ever got was during episode 27, when Garmadon asked if it was possible for an Oni to learn how to care. Lloyd told him maybe, and then during episode 28, Lloyd went right back to being angry at Garmadon. And once again, this doesn't make any sense at all in my opinion. When it comes to Lloyd, he was really quick to end up on good terms with Harumi, despite all the horrible stuff that she did over the events of the show, and Harumi never apologizing for it or taking any accountability for it. Yet when it comes to Lloyd, he was really angry at Garmadon over the events of Crystallized, and he never really apologized to Garmadon for the way that he treated him during the events of Crystallized. And I feel like this yet again shows how toxic Lloyd and Harumi's relationship is, given that, again, like I said, when it comes to Lloyd, he was really quick to end up on good terms with Harumi despite all the horrible stuff that she's done over the events of the show, and Harumi never once apologizing or taking any accountability for any of the stuff that she did. But before I move on, there is one other thing that I do want to quickly say, and it's something that I want to make very clear. I repeat, I am not saying that forgiving someone is a bad thing, because it's not. I feel like forgiving someone and choosing to see the good in people is a very good and a very important thing to do. However, at the exact same time, I feel like in some scenarios, not forgiving someone is arguably the better scenario. Especially when it comes to scenarios where it would be better for a person's mental health, and if when it comes to the person who is being forgiven, if they've done a lot of bad stuff, and if they haven't really done anything to change. And when it comes to the whole thing with Lloyd and Harumi, like I said, Lloyd continuously fixating on the idea of Harumi changing and her becoming a better person is not a healthy mindset for him to have. And when it comes to Harumi, she constantly did bad stuff to Lloyd over and over and over again over the events of the show, and Harumi never took any accountability for any of that horrible stuff, and she never apologized to Lloyd for any of the terrible stuff that she did over the events of the show. Plus, like I said, when it came to Harumi during episode 14 of Crystallized, she laughed at the idea of her changing, suggesting that Harumi was perfectly fine with her being a villain, and the only reason why Harumi even swapped sides and fought alongside the ninja in the first place was because the Overlord revealed that he corrupted the Great Devourer. Harumi didn't swap sides for some noble or good reason, she did it for a completely selfish reason. Meaning that when it comes to Harumi, she didn't really change during the final few episodes of Crystallized, she just blamed someone else for her problems, and then she acted like she did nothing wrong. And again, like I said, while I definitely feel like forgiving people is a very important thing to do, like I said, I feel like there are also some scenarios where not forgiving a person and distancing yourself from someone who's doing bad stuff and who hasn't really changed, in some scenarios, I feel like that is the better option, and I feel like the ending of Crystallized is a really good example of that. When it comes to Lloyd, I feel like the idea of him ending up on good terms with Harumi isn't a good thing, mainly because of all the really bad stuff that she's done to him over the events of the show, and Harumi didn't really do anything to actually change or become a good person. Again, she just swapped sides for a completely selfish reason, and then she acted like she never did anything wrong. And then, during the final moments of Crystallized, we see the rebuilding of the monastery, and we see that when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them are seemingly on good terms with one another, and this doesn't make any sense at all, because it completely goes against so much stuff when it comes to both of their characters. When it comes to Harumi, this completely goes against a major part of her character, which is her hating Lloyd and her wanting him to suffer, so Harumi being on good terms with Lloyd doesn't make any sense. Meanwhile, when it comes to Lloyd, this completely goes against Lloyd's Wild Brain character arc, which, like I said, revolved around Lloyd getting over Harumi and moving on from her, so Lloyd ending up on good terms with Harumi doesn't make any sense at all. However, that's not it, because there's something else about this situation that I want to point out. And it's that during that interview that he was on the TTV YouTube channel, Tommy Andreasen said that when it came to the fate of Lloyd and Harumi potentially getting together at some point in the future, that is up to interpretation. And this is something that I really don't like when it comes to the show, because the show is ending taking a super toxic and abusive relationship, and the show is saying it's okay if the two of them get together at some point in the future, all because Harumi did one good thing. And like I said, this is something that I really don't like. When it comes to Lloyd and Harumi and their fate being left up to interpretation, this is something that I really don't like because, like I said, this completely goes against Lloyd and Harumi and some major stuff when it comes to both their characters over the events of the show. However, at the exact same time, I feel like this sends a terrible message about abusive relationships because, again, when you boil everything down when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi's relationship, it is a relationship between Harumi, an abuser, and Lloyd, her victim, and the show is ending saying it's okay if the two of them get together at some point, all because Harumi was redeemed. And again, I feel like this sends a terrible message about abusive relationships, with the show essentially saying that when it comes to victims in abusive relationships, which Lloyd is, they could or even should forgive their abusers. And again, I feel like that is a terrible message to send when it comes to abusive relationships, and overall, when it comes to the idea of Lloyd and Harumi's fate being left up to interpretation, I feel like from a writing perspective, this doesn't make any sense at all because it completely goes against so much stuff when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi's characters. Plus, at the same time, like I said, I feel like this sends a terrible message about abusive relationships. And so, overall, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi and their relationship, like I said at the beginning of the video, I really didn't like it. Now, you may have noticed that all throughout the video, something that I was doing whenever I brought up Lloyd and Harumi's relationship was putting it in air quotes. And there's a big reason why I did that. It's because I feel like when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them don't have a relationship, and instead what they have is a cycle. A cycle of toxicity and abuse based on nothing but lies and deception, and it is fueled by Harumi's hatred of Lloyd, with her doing whatever she can to suffer and make him feel pain, while at the same time Harumi blames Lloyd for all the terrible stuff that happens to her, and she ends up manipulating Lloyd into believing that he is responsible for those bad things that happen to her, even though Lloyd has nothing to do with the bad things. Meanwhile, at the same time, Harumi ends up acting like she's the one who's gone through more pain in comparison to Lloyd, making it clear that Harumi doesn't care about Lloyd and all the horrible stuff that he's gone through over the events of the show. And when it comes to Lloyd, he constantly goes through a ton of pain, trauma, and abuse as a result of everything that Harumi does to him, while at the same time, Lloyd fixates on the idea of her changing and her becoming a better person, despite all the horrible stuff that she ends up doing to him over the events of the show. And the show ends up coming to an end saying it's okay if the two of them get together at some point, all because Harumi did one good thing for purely selfish reasons, which, like I said, it goes against so much stuff when it comes to both their characters, and at the same time, I feel it sends a really bad message about abusive relationships. Plus, at the same time, like I said earlier, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them are brother and sister because Garmadon adopted Harumi during season 9. So overall, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi and their relationship during the show, I really don't like it. And when you really take a look at Lloyd and Harumi and what goes on when it comes to these two during the events of the show, it is pretty obvious just how toxic and abusive their relationship really is. Plus, one other thing that I want to say when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi's relationship, and it's that, for me personally, I honestly find the stuff that happens between Lloyd and Harumi to be kind of hard to watch at times. Mainly because I personally really like Lloyd, and I think that he is a really great character when it comes to the show, and Lloyd is one of my favorite characters in all of Ninjago, and I honestly don't enjoy seeing him going through all this constant pain and suffering as a result of Harumi. Again, it makes it kind of hard to watch. Plus, couple that with all the horrible stuff that Harumi has done to Lloyd over the events of the show, with all the stuff that I talked about earlier, and also the fact that for me personally, I really don't like Harumi, and I think that she's the worst character in the show. Overall, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi's relationship, I really don't like it. And like I said, when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi and their relationship over the events of the show, it is so incredibly toxic and abusive, and by far my number one hope when it comes to Dragon's Rising is that when it comes to Lloyd and Harumi, the two of them don't get together during the events of Dragon's Rising. I really hope that doesn't happen during this era of the show. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me, was there anything that I left out when it came to Lloyd and Harumi and their relationship over the events of the show? Tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.